Good morning and welcome to another installment of Axiom today on the 90th day on lockdown here in South Africa. My name is Albert Jansen van Vieren from Andile for those who don't know me, and I'm standing in our offices, social distancing from everyone completely in a very sunny, warm winter's day in Johannesburg. So welcome to all of you guys joining us today. Just looking through people that have joined us, looking at Cornay. We've had some people that's been joining us for a couple of times now. James, welcome to joining us today. Lawrence, Lenka, Neil, Peter. We've got a Peter joining us today. And Tumisani, welcome to today's Axiom. So for today, we're going to launch something a bit different, and Andries will tell you more about that when we get there later on. But the format is going to remain the same as previously. We're going to start off with a talk or a discussion, a panel discussion, if I can call it that, today of about 40 minutes, where Andries will be speaking to Peter River, who will be joining us out of Cape Town. And again, Andries will introduce him to you later on. So throughout the session, we will be making use of some polls. And I'm quickly going to run just a poll to just, for those of you who haven't joined us on polls before, to just get yourself acquainted with a poll and what it is. So we're going to launch these polls for later on when we get to Q&A, and you can fill this in at this moment. And we'd just like to know, how do you stay informed on current news? Do you use any of these platforms? What is your preferred way of doing it? So Andries and Peter will be talking for about 40 minutes, and we'll go back to Q&A. And you can submit questions at any time during the session. We're not going to answer the questions live when the panel is ongoing, but in the bottom section, you'll see there's a Q&A button. You can use that and you can submit questions. And of course, we will be using the polls when we get to the end as well. I'm actually not going to say much more than that, just to welcome all of you. And at this point, I'm then going to introduce Andries and welcome him to today's Axiom.
Thank you, Albert.
You look comfortable in your office, Andries.
I am comfortable in my office, also social distancing. Nobody's with me, therefore not wearing a mask. But it's fun. I thought I'd just start by some introductory comments before we get to this poll, which is really interesting. So keep going, keep voting on that poll. It's really interesting reading, actually, so I'm glad we did it. But I just want to talk to the audience this morning. It's the first of what we call On the Brink, obviously a play on my surname. But the idea is really to start talking to people about individuals, people that make life what it is. There's so much groupthink in our world at the moment. People that just think that it's groups of people and sort of naturally forming communities that sort of define the world. It's not. It's people. It's individuals. It's human agency. And so, what we would like to achieve through this aspect of Axiom is to talk to interesting people and just to say what makes them tick, to really just listen, to introduce people and ways of thought to our Axiom members, so that we can have a discussion and just think, learn from one another. And so today we've got a friend like that, a friend of Andile, I would say, and Peter Brewer is a bit of he's an interesting person because he was a very senior in the corporate world in South Africa, specifically in the media, which I think is an extremely interesting sector at the moment. He started his career as a journalist working for online platform, which is on your poll at the moment, News 24. So Business 24, he was working with Finweek, the publication online. He was ultimately progressed through his career, and he was ultimately the general manager of the Burger newspaper, Afrikaans daily paper in around the Western Cape, as well as Sake 24, Business 24. And then he sort of walked out of the newsroom, and I think that's the interesting part of today's discussion. And he started his own public relations agency, PVPR, just over a decade ago. But he wasn't just a corporate guy or just an entrepreneur. He was also very active in the in society. And I think that makes him a truly unique individual, someone who's also giving back to society all the time. So he was a former chairperson of the Greater Johannesburg Business Chamber. Used to be the biggest business chamber in South Africa, certainly. He was also the chairperson of the Penduring Advertising Awards, which is a fun event. I've been to, I think, 2 Penduring events. It's really a great event and a good initiative. And he was vice chairman of the Cape Town Business Chamber, obviously, when he moved down to Cape Town. So Peter, welcome on the first edition of On the Brink with Axiom. It's a pleasure to have you. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at this poll and see what people are saying, because I think it's fascinating. 86% of our viewers get their daily dose of news from online platforms like News24. And I think what gets my attention immediately is that television news only gets 18% and radio only gets 18%. It's only 18% of where we get our news from. So what is happening? Everything is changing.
Yeah.
Fascinating stuff.
I think even more than the 86% of people finding news on online platforms is the 27% who say they find their news at the water cooler or where people talk in the office. And there must be some truth in that. I mean, just think how many times you hear something informally somewhere. And I think depending on the nature of the person who hears the news, you either immediately believe it, or you're intrigued enough to go Google, which we all do, to find out what's the story behind the story. So I think it's probably a true reflection of where people get their news from. The interesting one for me, and I think a good one for me to see, because I had to make a call more than a decade ago, being in the newspaper industry, is that 0% get their news from newspapers. And I think I came to a stage in my career where I knew the writing was on the wall and I could not see a future in newspapers going forward. And that was part of the reason for stepping out of the newsroom. I could have gone onto an online platform, but the desire was always there to run my own business. So it was time, and the demise of the newspaper industry kind of just prompted me to eventually do that. But thanks for hosting me, Andries. I find it quite interesting to be on the other side of being interviewed. I normally sit on your side. And it is actually a little bit daunting to sit on this side.
Excellent. That's exactly what we want. We want you uncomfortable.
I'm kind of now expected to say something worthwhile, and I don't know if I actually have something worthwhile to say. So let's see how this goes.
Your story is worthwhile to us. That's all we want. So I think that this is a loaded poll, and obviously it's very subjective, and it's to a very specific audience. I think the listeners to Axiom are typically digitally mobile, and people who you'd expect them to sort of be with the times, but 0% people voting for newspapers is quite an indictment. And it's also a problem, isn't it? Because I think that, and we'll be touching on that a bit later, but the media model hasn't reacted to this new phenomenon. I think that the type of money that is available to media outlets at the moment is very different to what it was 10, 15, 20 years ago, even as a short time frame ago as that. So that different business has really been disrupted by tech, and we see it in our little poll on Axiom webinars here. Peter, I'm interested. So they say once a media man, always a media man. But where did it start for you? I think were you a curious individual from day one? I mean, were you born that way, or did you learn that way? Or? what makes you want to think, ink on your fingers, as it were?
Thanks, Andries. Before I answer that question, I actually just want to touch on the 0% for newspapers. You know, as the world progressed and online media became stronger, I always found it quite interesting that if you think of a newspaper, it's you have to plant a tree, grow it for between 18 and 22 years, which is the time you have to grow a tree before it's worth taking down, transport it to some plant where it gets boiled into pulp, printed into paper, ink gets printed on it, and it's, you know, it comes out at 6 in the morning, and by 12 o'clock, you can't use it anymore. It's a strange way to distribute news, and not very sustainable. So the 0% makes a lot of sense, because there's better offerings available. But in the process, the business model, and I'm just jumping into it because it's kind of on the table, but the business model for a newspaper, if you go into the nuts and bolts of how the finances work, advertisements were charged by per centimeter column in a newspaper. So you have 7 columns over a page, and each of them get a certain amount of centimeters, and you pay per centimeter that you advertise. And, you know, to advertise, let's say I want to take a full page ad in something like the Sunday Times, the cost involved, I can start a small franchise business with the money I have to pay to take a full page ad in a national newspaper. So that business model supported quite large newsrooms where you had lots of journalists and lots of checks and balances in place. You know, in my younger days as a journalist, when I wrote a story, it went through 6 or 7 layers of editing before it finally got published. And much more senior people than me read it and checked the facts and obviously the grammar and spelling. So that depth has definitely fallen away in terms of the size of the newsroom. So more people working on less stories, so you have time for higher quality stories. And also the process behind it, checking the facts and the editing. So what I'm finding, and most of what I'm going to say today is just my opinion, is that this proliferation of online media that we have, the business model behind it, the income levels are not that high. Therefore, the newsrooms are smaller, massively smaller.
Right.
And the depth of editing and fact-checking behind it is also not what it used to be. And therefore the quality is sometimes suspect, not in all cases. There's some really excellent smaller media companies that do well. And it's very often a individual, the owner, that's behind the news making. So it's just quickly touching on that because it is leaving a gap, and the media has not evolved enough to fill that gap. We do have less journalists around than in the past. Yeah, and then the water cooler one is still interesting, and I have to touch on that as well before I answer your question. My apologies, Andries, but
no, go for it.
It reminded me of a story that my wife told me. She was at the hair salon, and there was riots next to the N2, and the police was not coping with the riots, and they brought in a private security firm popularly known as the Red Ants, to help them to contain the riots and keep people away from the N2 so that the cars could drive. And a lady in the salon mistakenly identified the Red Ants as the Red Berets of the EFF. And she told everyone in the salon that the EFF is invading the neighborhood next to the N2. And everyone believed it. My wife came home telling me the EFF is invading the town. And I was like, no, wait a second, I'm not quite believing this. Where did you hear this? No, someone in the salon said the EFF is invading the town. And it's how quickly a story that is completely false can spread because someone mentioned something and no one actually had the knowledge or put in the effort to check the facts. And yeah, we'll probably talk about this a little bit later, but I think in the society we live in, it has become every individual's task to just check the facts. You know, make sure if you hear a story, just see if someone else is also reporting it. If it's this single standalone, difficult to believe story, and there's only one small suspect website reporting on it, it is probably fake news and not worth giving it your attention. If it's not fake news, it will repeat somewhere and it will become a larger story. But yeah, so that was just on those two subjects. I thought that it was interesting to note.
Maybe just pick up on that. I think that, you know, we're living in an age where technology is really winning wars, and wars are not necessarily what we thought they were. I think wars, the very aspect and the concept of it is also changing. But I mean, if you think about the printing press, not so long ago, that was the technology that really won the war. If you look at the Protestant Revolution and the Renaissance in Europe, that was driven by the printing press. In other words, free access to information, very quick access to sort of nimble methods of distributing information through the printing press. And what we're deciding today is, I think our little poll shows us that the printing press officially is dead and dying a very real death at the moment. I'm sure that some of the editors of some of the newspapers would disagree with me, but the facts are that, you know, readerships have not increased in a long time. In fact, it's certainly decreasing. But what I find interesting is that, you know, exactly what we're doing today. We're doing a broadcast of television, almost quality, that in the 60s would have been millions to do, and that would be millions of dollars in the 1960s type of currency. You know, where today we're doing a broadcast where you're in Cape Town, I'm in Joburg, and we think nothing of it. And at the same time, what we're seeing in our poll is that only 23% of our people takes to Twitter for news. So that suggests to me that the Axiom viewers are quite wise in that they know that, you know, Twitter isn't a real source of news, or it may be a real source of news, and certainly is a modern water cooler, I would say. But it's news that needs to be treated with some concern, and I think the obligation is on the reader. It's buyer beware, reader beware what you believe when you read sort of technologically relevant news, because there hasn't been a form of sifting. There hasn't been what you mentioned. There hasn't been quality control on the issues that are being raised. I think people just speak, which is something we're finding our way around at the moment. We're sort of trying to get used to this new phenomenon.
That's an interesting point. And please remind me to just get back to the newspaper, the 0% for the newspaper. I think there's still some form of newspaper and print that will survive for quite some time. And I want to make a comment on that. But in terms of Twitter, our poll suggested that 86% of people find their news from online news sources. But there's actually a deeper statistic behind that. If you look at how people consume media, the social media platforms that you visit, in most cases, and the research in the USA specifically shows that most people access news through their social media platform. So you're on Facebook, you're scrolling through your Facebook, you're looking at what your friends are doing, and one of the groups or pages you are interested in is a news site or a micro news site that feeds into your realm of attention. And then you click on that, and that's the news you look at. So your social media is actually dictating what news comes across your screen, and that news is not sifted by an individual or a group of people that work with news. It is a program that kind of seeks for what you are interested in. It picks up all your media use over all the platforms you are, and it then feeds into your what's interesting to you. So yeah. what ends up happening is your worldview gets reiterated over and over and over again by the news sites you visit, because your social media programming behind it feeds into your attention and interests, and you end up having a possibly quite an isolated view of the world if you're not willing to look beyond your social media news feeds. Therefore, it's good to subscribe to some sort of general big media news feed just to check. But on the other side, and this is a personal view, but the more your worldview gets supported by what you read, the more you're going to realize how many other opinions are out there that differ from yours. And you all of a sudden experience this really shattered world where there's just this proliferation of opinions. And it could lead to feeling quite isolated, and it's daunting. And I think the fact that there's so many media outlets, more media outlets available than just 20 years ago, is making it difficult sometimes to cope with all the opinions.
Yeah, but we've sort of touched on it, but traditionally the role of the media was to serve as a fourth estate. In other words, to act as a moral compass also to society, to hold up a mirror, as it were, to society, and to say, well, this is what's going on, to sort of play back, but also to drive opinion, to have an objective view, and to say, well, this is what's happening, and this is why we think about it in this way, in the form of editorials and things like that, to also form opinions. But I think that recently, because of what you've described and the sort of downsizing of the newsroom, these traditional catch-alls and sort of safety mechanisms have also been eroded. And so I've certainly seen a polarization of the media, and I take your point. I think it's very important for us to read as far and wide as we can. I know personally, I read, politically, I read from the far right to the far left. I read everyone because I want to see the opinions and the counter perspectives on all measures. But I think this sort of degrading of the fourth estate is worrying. I find it very worrying, because what I've seen is the polarization in the media. You sort of, let's not speak about South African media, because I don't want to put words in the mouth. But if you listen to American media, you know exactly what you're going to get out of CNN, because they have a certain, sort of a neoliberal view, which is sort of far left, which they just keep on pushing, because they know that they've got a certain viewership that sort of responds to that. And if they want advertising, which they need to keep alive because of the threat that they have in the new media, they need to start, keep on playing to that audience. Similarly, on the right, you've got Fox News, and they have a certain party line which they just keep on towing, and in the end, I think it's degrading, and I think it's not helpful, because it's not forming, we don't have that battle of opinion. We don't have that marketplace for opinions that is vibrant anymore. We just have people spewing ideology, and that's worrying, don't you think? Why am I wrong? Am I missing it?
No. I'm going to be careful to give an opinion here, because I don't actually know what the solution is. But your assumption is not, or your opinion is not wrong. I think this leads into a much larger problem than just the media. I think it filters down to the media. There's a certain challenge around how we work with listed companies. And in the past, media companies, if in general, media companies were started way back by people who were actually interested in generating news.
Right.
And the profit was a part of why they did it. But as the world has progressed, media has become big business, and media companies were bought over by bigger businesses who were listed. And listed companies have shareholders, and shareholders need profits.
Right.
And those profits are sometimes not sustainable. Let's rather say the percentages that's required to be popular with the fund managers and large investors are not always sustainable. And therefore the businesses, media, to me, it feels like the big media has lost a little bit of focus from quality journalism to making profits to keep shareholders happy. And one of the newspapers I worked for in my earlier years ran for over a decade at a loss before it started making a profit. But that was before the company was listed. And we often mused about the fact that this paper would not have existed, and it's a big national newspaper. It would not have existed if it was part of a listed company, because no listed company and shareholders would have allowed the business to run at a loss for over a decade. When it did start making money, it did well.
And that's a good thing, right?
Yes, it is a good thing, because there was a focus on quality, and eventually the profits followed. And it was long-term thinking, not short-term thinking. And listed media companies are unfortunately forced to work within short-term profit parameters. And it has a big influence on the quality of journalism and the size of the newsrooms. I want to ask the question, don't you think media companies were used for propaganda in the past? I don't know how much of that has changed. I think there's always been big opinions or big money behind the opinions in media. It's probably just the quality of reporting that has suffered. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to stay away from answering that one, because I'm actually not too sure.
It has always been the case. I think you're absolutely right. One only needs to read on any revolution to see who controlled the media, really controlled the public thought. I think it was Lenin who said, if I can write the songs of the peasants, I can control their thoughts. Effectively saying the pen is mightier than the sword, as everybody's agreed to since times began. But you're quite right. It's always been the case, and that's why I think it's important for just little outfits like Kandile to put out a counter view and say, well, this is what we believe, and so listen to us or don't. It's your call. But I think that is the opportunity in the modern setting, where we can actually, if you're willing to put your name to it, you can have an opinion and you can put it out there, and people may or may not listen, and that's okay. I'm interested in, so you get to a point in your life, you've sort of reached a very, very high point in corporate life. I mean, you're the boss of one of the biggest papers in the country, probably the biggest, if I remember correctly, a weekly at least, daily. What makes you walk out? I mean, why go and be, let's say, a small business owner or an entrepreneur? What makes one make that harsh? What makes you walk away from the pension and the benefits and the share scheme and the, all those things? The big paycheck, I should say.
Yeah, that leads to another part of the conversation, and I'm sure lots of people listening will experience the same. But I never ever started out working to be in a corporate environment. It was not my goal after I finished the studying to be part of a large corporate for the rest of my life. I've always wanted to run my own business. The corporate life just held me longer than what I actually wanted to stay. And the corporate life has got a wonderful way of ensnaring you with things that make you feel valuable and important, and possible riches at the end of the rainbow. But it does not leave you with from my personal experience, with the same level of joy as running your own business. There's a massive freedom that comes with running your own business, and on the same time, with that freedom, immense mental toughness that you need to apply to always keep the doors open and make sure everyone gets their salaries on a monthly basis. So the decision to leave the corporate environment was not a difficult one. It was a question of timing. And that goes into another philosophical discussion, and that is, you start out your career doing the work of a specialist. Most people do that. They don't start as a manager of people. And often the work of a specialist is your career choice. Let's take an engineer. You want to be an engineer because you like building things and like the way things are put together. I started as a journalist because from a very young age, I knew I wanted to be a journalist. I never had that challenge of not knowing what I want to do with my life. The better I became at being a journalist, the more I moved away from it, because I got promoted into managing journalists and then eventually managing the business. And that was completely not what I wanted to do with my life. So you have to get to a point where you make the decision to move back to something more fundamental, something more specialist. The joy of work for me is not, it's in the ability to do something that I believe I'm good at. And when I finish the day, to look back and think, okay, I did a fair good job there. I'm proud of what I've done. And it was close to 6 years that I was in a very senior position. And you have very little joy on a daily basis, because there's so many moving parts to what you do that not one single act can give you joy. That joy gets taken away a half an hour later by a crisis in the business. So you end up just, I felt a bit like a slave, to be honest. And my last 3 years was spent after the massive economic crisis we had in 2007. And the media was hit particularly hard. And I was forced to restructure 2 companies within the business, and unfortunately I had to cut staff. And it was not a very enjoyable part of my career. And one particular day, I sat and looked at myself as if the teenage version of me was looking at me. And I just realized that this is not who I want to be. So I actually didn't discuss it with anyone. I went into work at that level. At that level, you don't resign. You force them to pay you to leave. So I negotiated my exit, and I went home and told my family I had just resigned my job. So it was just enough is enough. And sometimes you've got to be able to say enough is enough. The beauty of what followed was, in hindsight now, it was the best thing I could have done. But I just sat in my office at home and I thought, you know, what do I have to offer the world? I can write a little. I can manage a business a little. Maybe I should start a PR agency. I only decided that once I left. I always knew I'll be able to do something that generates money. There wasn't a doubt. That there was firm belief and faith that I can start something that will leave me and the family okay. But the PR agency route was a very satisfying route. I thoroughly enjoy what I do. And I believe I add value, and the agency adds value to my clients. And I really enjoy the fact that we do add value, and that, you know, I have clients that really set store by us and what we do for them. So it's a fulfilling life to lead, and very real. But of course, with small business ownership, there comes lots of things that you never ever thought you'd have to do. In the beginning days, you know, so one of the staff members' computer wouldn't work, and there's no one else to fix it but you. The printer runs out of paper, and there's no one to send to the store to go buy paper. You have to go do it. You know, so going from a large corporate environment with secretaries that run your diaries to being everything was initially quite humbling, and later on I really enjoyed doing the smaller tasks. It gave me a sense of being grounded.
But it's interesting. I mean, and thank you for sharing that story, because that's exactly what we want. You know, those are big decisions, man, and it's like there's no one that can coach you through that. You know, you've just got to follow your heart. You've got to follow your gut. You've got to do what you've got to do. And I think the way in which you told it was it happens that way for many people, you know. And but I think that the truth to it, and which is really interesting, is you're mentioning the fact that you want to feel valuable. And I think that's a part of the human condition that is so critical. And I think the point is that is something that every single individual needs to decide on an ongoing basis. It's important for you to almost have that daily inclination to say, I'm going to be better today than what I was yesterday. And I think that what I'm trying to say by that is if we don't do something that is based in our skill set, to feel useful is very difficult. And it sounded to me like what you're saying is, at the moment in your PR world, you're seeing your work, i.e. your writing, because I know that you enjoy writing and you do that often. You still see that going out, and you see that changing something, you know, doing something for someone, and that's useful, and it feels good. So I just want to, Peter, before you respond to that, I just want to say that I see Albert was saying, please, everyone, we've got Q&A. So if you have questions, please ask them now. I think, Albert, are we going to fly to another poll? Because we are running tight on time. It's 1:45. So if there's another poll, let's fly that one now.
Yeah, let's do that. I think this one is going to be a bit of an interesting one, and you did touch on this earlier. But yeah, I think if we can ask do you trust the content published by the media? This is a very topical question to ask at this point. I think with COVID-19 and everything that's gone on, there's been a lot of blame thrown probably to the media and people, the conspiracy theory people out there with saying, well, this is something just, and can you trust what's in the media? Can you not trust? And I did throw in the COVID thing now, and we haven't spoken about that, but maybe it's a question that's going to go out there, and you can see the results coming in. We did on these polls today, we allowed you to give multiple answers. So that's why the mathematicians out there, and I know you're one of them, Richard, says, hey, but those percentages don't match up if I look at the amount of people out there. But just because you can choose multiple answers if you would like to do. But Andries, yes, that's the next poll that we throw out there.
Excellent, thanks. And then also remember questions, guys. You're welcome to ask those questions. Peter, but back to your story. It's fascinating stuff.
I got captivated by the poll, and I completely forgot what you asked me, Andries.
No, I was saying that just that human requirement for all of us to on a daily basis do something that's worthwhile and important, and to actually have some form of collateral, some form of artifact to look at and say, I did that, that was me. And I guess to work in a corporate, you sort of lose track on that, don't you?
Yeah, the larger the responsibility, the less individual moments you have of really experiencing success. So in terms of what we do, I really enjoy going into someone else's business and looking for stories to tell. I enjoy the fact that I can help them to get publicity and to be noticed. As a journalist, I was always intrigued by people I meet who know so much more than me about the subjects I write. And it was quite humbling to sit at dinner tables and to listen to people that are not even well known in the industry. And you quickly realize how very well informed and knowledgeable they are. And it's fun to highlight those people and get their stories and tell them. I prefer being in the background. I don't like being on the side of the interview table. It's good to live a life where you feel you add value, but also to do something that you find fun, and you have to be competent at it. It's no use doing something you're not competent at. It's going to be excruciating.
You did a question from my side, and then we're going to get to the actual questions from our listeners, from our viewers. But I think that what's happened in the media industry is very interesting, because you've got a lot of freelancers, and I know that your firm, you use quite a few freelancers, so you don't have people on staff all the time. You also use specialists in their area. And so these freelancers almost provide services, microservices to your industry. And I think they're an incredibly important part of the media machine as it is at the moment, or let's say generation of content as it is at the moment. But so in a sense, the media world or the content generation world has made this shift to what is now known as a gig economy, sort of small pieces of work, piecemeal type working arrangements, long before anybody else has. I think that's been in operation in the media world for maybe 10, 15 years, which is possibly a result of the pressures, the financial pressures, where people are actually being held to what you can produce rather than just sitting in a cushy job. Is that a sort of a trend that you're seeing across, because you now work in multiple industries? I mean, your clients are all over. Is that a trend that you can see sort of happening, sort of this skills-based economy developing?
The trend, the larger trend I noticed even before the COVID crisis, coronavirus crisis, was for companies to have less staff in the office and more people working from home. The next step to that will be more people working freelance in industries that's non-traditional with freelance. It's just a trend that I've noticed. Once again, this is my opinion. But in the media industry, using the freelance people as staff has been a much bigger trend. A funny story, we closed our offices. We do not have offices. I deemed that a total waste of money for a PR agency. I think 7 years ago already. Everyone's been working from home, and there was a marked increase in quality and volume of work for me when everyone moved to work from home, but it works for us as a PR agency. I don't know if it will work for everyone. And we do talk, we've learned to talk regularly, either over the phone, well, preferably over the phone. I'm not a big fan of Skype or Zoom meetings all the time. What happened was we could hire in the best of breed for every single job and client we have. So up till about 2015, there was permanent staff located in an office, and we had to make do with what they could do for all the clients because they were permanent staff and we had to use them. With freelance workers, I can pick the best I can find per client and apply the knowledge and experience behind that. So it's a much better business model. Although I do pay higher rates for the freelance worker than for the permanent staff. But the quality is so much better.
Peter, I'm going to get to a question that we have on our Q&A board. It's from Richard, and he asks about the traditional role of the media holding up a mirror to society. I think we touched on that when we spoke about the fourth estate. But the second part of his question is: are journalists oblivious to the damage that their lack of independence is doing? In other words, do you think journalists? That's a great question, because you were a journalist, so you'd be able to have some insight to that.
Yeah. From the PR agency side, there's one answer, and then as a journalist, there's a second answer. As someone working in PR, I often find that if a journalist criticizes a client unduly, because I try and be fair, if I don't want to influence a process if there's fair criticism. I also have a reputation to uphold, and if there's a client that did something wrong, I find it difficult to support. But if I'm convinced that the criticism was undue, it often helps just to put the journalist face to face with who they were criticizing, and then that faceless person you were writing about disappears and it becomes a human being. And then it's much more difficult to write something that could be harmful because you know who it will harm. And as a journalist, I also found that to try and keep in mind who I'm writing about.
Yeah.
But there's this general sense that when you reach a certain level of celebrity status in life, then you're fair game to everyone. And unfortunately, there's some truth in that, although it's not justified always.
I think one of the ways in which I normally look at sort of comment sections around reports that goes out, because I think the comment section are often more informative than the actual articles, the newsworthy articles that goes out. But one of the ways I normally try and look at that is whenever someone writes under some sort of a pseudonym, in other words, he's refers to himself as the Avenger or something stupid like that. I just discredit that comment immediately, because the only people that you can trust is the one who's willing to put their names to something. If you're willing to put your name against something, and then, in other words, enter the debate from a known perspective, then I think I can take your opinion seriously. But we see that, normally on comment sections, the guys making outlandish statements are the ones who tries to remain anonymous and then just say stuff. And that's, I think, a good way to sort of sift through, things as well. So from a journalistic perspective, Richard, I think, I agree. I think some of the damage caused is hectic. And you would know in our media recently, Prime Media fired one of their preeminent journalists or talk show hosts, and I think that was a good thing. So I think there is a semblance of responsibility that still lies, and that sometimes, even though it takes a long time because of employment sort of protection laws that we have in our country, the right thing sort of does tend to happen over time. Neil's question, is there an obligation on the online real news publications, the real news, I don't know what that means, Neil, but I take your point as the traditional institutions, to not to tailor their news according to social media habits, talking about the iterative nature of social media sort of being a self-fulfilling prophecy, fueling your own views. So should they take an objective view? And is it an obligation? In other words, are they almost regulated to do that, Peter?
Yeah, I think there's a fair amount of regulation in the media industry itself. We have a press ombudsman who you can report unfair reporting to, and the industry is quite well self-regulated. One, two, the larger media companies with strong newsrooms, there's more ethics behind those newsrooms than what people could imagine or suspect. Every newsroom has an editor, and below the editor there's sub-editors and deputy editors who also monitor quality of reporting. And there's this fine line where good editors will know what I'm talking about. Objective reporting versus activism is quite noticeable when you're an editor. So as soon as your reporters go from reporting to becoming activists and filtering certain opinions beyond what they should be, you do pick up on that. And that person then, the quality of that report diminishes over time. So your mainstream big media outlets still do have good quality news that's regulated well within the industry. And you will often find that the big breaking stories gets reported on various platforms. IOL News 24 would have the same stories running with slightly different angles, but the truth is in there. So if you really want to find the truth of a matter, try and read more than one angle on a story and decide for yourself, because ultimately you have to make your own opinion.
I think that sort of fits in nicely with Niels's question, who asks, how do we find credible sources of news beyond the daily sensationalism? I think there's a lot of sensationalism. Sort of, how do you determine it's sensationalist reporting and there's really no fact behind it? How do we judge fake news from the real thing. I think you mentioned that, you know, multiple sources and multiple angles on the same thing is important, because often that's also just to find a secondary opinion sort of verifies the fact that it is real news. I guess that's a, you know, the word of truth is established on a witness at least, you know. So if it's only one little outlet, as you mentioned earlier, reporting on something, you should probably take that with a pinch of salt. But how do we find credible sources of news, you know, in the daily grind? Because it seems to me like there's a more responsibility on the individual to find truth than in the past, where you could sort of almost rely on this process that you've discussed and described in the newsroom to provide the integrity of the reporting. I think there's less of it now. How do guide us? How should we think about it?
I think if you've got a preferred news source that you use on a regular basis, let's move away from South African example. Let's use an American example. Let's say you prefer watching CNN on a daily basis. Then it would be worth your while checking what Al Jazeera would be publishing on the same story. It could be directly opposed to what you see on CNN, and it can give you a much more informed opinion on what's happening behind it. So it's good to get opposing views and form your own opinion. It could help.
Right. I think we're going to have to cut it there. It's 12 o'clock. My goodness, time flies. It was lovely to speak to you. Thank you. And I think that, as always, when we speak to people from different industries, from different walks of life, different ways of working, things that may be you know, normal to you and the way in which you describe things, we find fascinating. So thank you. It was good insights, and thank you for your stories. We'll speak again soon. And Albert, I'm going to hand over to you on that note. Thank you very much, Peter. Thanks for joining us. It was really good to talk.
Thank you, Andries. Good to talk.
Great. Thanks, Peter. Thanks for joining us. That was really great conversation there. Thanks, Peter, Andries as well for hosting it. That was our first webinar, Axiom webinar of On the Brink, and I think that gives you a bit of a taste of what we want. We want to be able to speak the truth. We want to be able to portray the truth, and from our side, from Axiom's side as well. And Andries, appreciate it. It was well hosted, and it was good, thought-provoking content. And thank you to everyone who joined us today for the questions you submitted as well, and for your time. We don't take that for granted. One last thing before we go, just a bit of just to share with you of what's coming up. So next week, well, on the 8th of July, we will be having Bernard Boosie. Bernard is one of our senior software engineers here at Andile, and he will just talking to us about the shape of blockchain. Is it fit to compete? Is it one of those square pegs in a round hole, or is it actually fit to compete? So it's going to be a bit more of a technical session. Please join us for that. And then 2 weeks after that, on the 22nd of July, we will have another installment of On the Brink, where we will be having Russell Lamberti. Andries, maybe you're still online. Maybe do you want to give us a bit of just an intro to Russell?
Yeah, I think Russell Lamberti is probably the premier technical economist in the country at the moment, probably on the continent. He's an extremely smart guy, young guy, but he's also an entrepreneur. He runs a company called ETM Analytics, so he actually runs a whole economic outfit. He's not an entrepreneur. He's not an economist with a big bank or something like that. So he's an entrepreneur economist, extremely technical. And what I specifically like about Russell is his great integrity and forthright about the issues. He was part of the Panda initiative, which essentially measured COVID in a different way. And he's been up against government since day one, almost, not fighting, but really saying that, we need to look at statistics objectively. We need to look at the economic reality. And he's been towing that line from day one, and certainly at a big personal cost. So great guy, huge integrity, and as I mentioned, a very, very strong economist, that's focusing on the micro models within the economy.
Yeah, great. Well, so that's on the 22nd of July. Looking forward to that. So we will be sharing with you soon registration links for these 2 sessions. But as always, if you have any questions, any thoughts, if you want access to the recordings or want to have a discussion with any of the panelists, please just email us at axiom@andilesolutions.com. And that is it for us. Stay safe, stay warm out there, and we will be chatting soon again. Thank you for joining us today. Cheers, everyone.